So I think it's worth getting the timeline right.
Yeah.
So the following things are baked in. You're going to have an agentic revolution
Mhm.
where agents are connected to solve business processes, government processes, and so forth. They will be adopted most quickly in companies that have a lot of money and a lot of time latency issues at stake. It will be adopted most slowly in places like government, which do not have an incentive for innovation, and fundamentally are job programs and redistribution of income kind of programs.
Mhm.
So call it what you will. The important thing is that there will be a tip of the spear in places like financial services, certain kind of biomedical things, startups, and so forth. And that's the place to watch. So all of that is going to happen. The agents are going to happen. This math thing is going to happen. The software thing is going to happen. We can debate the rate at which the biological revolution will occur, but everyone agrees that it's right after, that we're very close to these major biological understandings. In physics, you're limited by data, but you can generate it synthetically. There are groups which I'm funding, which are generating physics, essentially models
Mhm.
that can approximate algorithms that cannot be, they're incomputable. So, in other words, you have essentially a foundation model that can answer the question good enough for the purposes of doing physics without having to spend a million years doing the computation of, quantum chromodynamics and things like that.
Yep.
All of that's going to happen. The next questions have to do with what is the point in which this becomes a national emergency?
Hmm.
And it goes something like this. Everything I've talked about is in the positive domain, but there's a negative domain as well. The ability for biological attacks, obviously cyber attacks. Imagine a cyber attack that we as humans cannot conceive of, which means there's no defense for it because no one ever thought about it, right? These are real issues. A biological attack, you take a virus, I won't obviously go into the details. You take a virus that's bad and you make it undetectable by some changes in its structure, which again, I won't go into the details. We released a whole report at the national level on this issue. So at some point, the government, and it doesn't appear to understand this now, is going to have to say, this is very big because it affects national security, national economic strengths, and so forth. Now, China clearly understands this, and China is putting an enormous amount of money into this. We have slowed them down by virtue of our chips controls, but they've found clever ways around this. There are also proliferation issues. Many of the chips that they're not supposed to have, they seem to be able to get. And
Mhm.
more importantly, as I mentioned, the algorithms are changing. And instead of having these expensive foundation models by themselves, you have continuous updating, which is called test time training. That continuous updating appears to be capable of being done with lesser powered chips. So there are so many questions that I think we don't know. We don't know the role of open source because remember, open source means open weights, which means everyone can use it. A fair reading of this is that every country that's not in the West will end up using open source because they'll perceive it as cheaper, which transfers leadership in open source from America to China.
Mhm.
That's a big deal,
Yep.
right? If that occurs. How much longer do the chip bans, if you will, hold, and how long before China can answer? What are the effects of the current government's policies of getting rid of foreigners and foreign investment? What happens with the Arab data centers, assuming they work? And I'm generally supportive of them. If those things are then misused to help train Chinese models, the list just goes on and on. We just don't know.
Okay, can I ask you probably one of the toughest questions? I don't know if you saw Mark Andreessen. He went and talked to the Biden administration, past administration, and said, "How are we going to deal with exactly what you just talked about, chemical and biological and radiological and nuclear risks from big foundation models being operated by foreign countries?" And the Biden answer was, we're going to keep it into the 3 or 4 big companies like Google, and we'll just regulate them. And Mark was like, that is a surefire way to lose the race with China because all innovation comes from a startup that you didn't anticipate, or, it's just the American history, and you're cutting off the entrepreneur from participating in this. So as of right now, with the open source models, the entrepreneurs are in great shape. But if you think about the models getting crazy smart a year from now, how are we going to have the balance between startups actually being able to work with the best technology, but proliferation not percolating to every country in the world?
Again, a set of unknown questions. And anybody who knows the answer to these things is not telling the full truth.
Hmm.
The doctrine in the Biden administration was called 10 to the 26 flops. It was a point that was a consensus above which the models were powerful enough to cause some damage. So the theory was that if you stayed below 10 to the 26, you didn't need to be regulated. But if you were above that, you needed to be regulated. And the proposal in the Biden administration was to regulate both the open source and the closed source.
Mm-hmm.
Okay,
Okay.
those are the summary.
Yep.
That, of course, has been ended by the Trump administration. They have not yet produced their own thinking in this area. They're very concerned about China and it getting forward, so they'll come out with something. From my perspective, the core questions are the following. Will the Chinese be able to use, even with chip restrictions, will they use architectural changes that will allow them to build models as powerful as ours?
Mm-hmm.
And let's assume they're government funded. That's the first question. The next question is, how will you raise $50 billion for your data center if your product is open source?
Yeah.
In the American model, part of the reason these models are closed is that the business people and the lawyers correctly are saying, I've got to sell this thing because I've got to pay for my capital. These are not free goods.
Yep.
And the US government correctly is not giving $50 billion to these companies.
Mm-hmm.
So we don't know that. To me, the key question to watch is look at DeepSeek. So DeepSeek, a week or so ago, Gemini 2.5 Pro got to the top of the leaderboards in intelligence.
Yep.
Great achievement for my friends at Gemini. A week later, DeepSeek comes in and is slightly better than Gemini. And DeepSeek is trained on the existing hardware that's in China, which includes stuff that's been pilfered and some of the Ascend, it's called the Ascend Huawei chips and a few others. What happens? Now, the US people say, well, the DeepSeek people cheated. And they cheated by doing a technique called distillation, where you take a large model and you ask it 10,000 questions, you get its answers, then you use that as your training material.
Yep.
So the US companies will have to figure out a way to make sure that their proprietary information that they've spent so much money on does not get leaked into these open source things. I just don't know. With respect to nuclear, biological, chemical, and so forth issues, the US companies are doing a really good job of looking for that. There's a great concern, for example, that nuclear information would leak into these models as they're training without us knowing it. Mm-hmm. And by the way, that's a violation of law.
Right? Oh, really?
They work, yeah, and the whole nuclear information thing is there's no free speech in that world for good reasons. Oh. And there's no free use and copyright and all that kind of stuff. It's illegal to do it. And so they're doing a really, really good job of making sure that that does not happen. They also put in very significant tests for biological information and certain kinds of cyber attacks. What happens there? Their incentive to continue, especially if it's not required by law. The government has just gotten rid of the safety institutes that were in place in Biden and are replacing it by a new term, which is largely a safety assessment program, which is a fine answer. I think collectively, we in the industry just want the government at the secret and top secret level to have people who are really studying what China and others are doing. You can be sure that China really has very smart people studying what we're doing. We at the secret and top secret level should have the same thing.